So in the late to mid 1970s through the 90s, there was a lot of changes that were occurring in graphic design. Some people call this time or this movement deconstruction. And design was sort of breaking away from the more rigid model that was created through the International Typographic Style or Swiss design. And new technologies were really kind of reshaping and making people approach design differently. So a major invention that occurred was in 1980, Macintosh released the Apple computer. And this was really huge in the design industry. Computers replaced many of the skilled trades in graphics and enabled one person to fill many roles. And also the growth of cable and satellite TV took ad revenue away from major stations and transformed mass market advertising into smaller and more specific audiences. And then things kept coming, like the invention of the mouse, for example, which enabled direct interactivity to the computer. Instead of pre-mouse, you had to do lengthy programming and typing code, which was difficult for most people. And then software was being invented, new softwares. In 1990, Quark Express enabled designers to place elements in increments of 100,000th of an inch. Photoshop enabled image manipulation and creation. So post-Photoshop, people would have to use enlargers in dark rooms, and it would take a lot of effort to create a collaged image. But with computers and the invention of Photoshop, this changed. Now it takes literally 5 seconds to do a really intricate collage in Photoshop. So it's really hard for us at this time in history to grasp how much change occurred within like a 10 to 15 year time period. But it was really significant, especially for the graphic design industry. But it took a while. Very few designers worked with computer technology right away. Even in the 90s, desktop publishing was separate than graphic design. And the production people used the computer and the designers came up with, it was kind of like the production people used the computers and the designers come up with the ideas. So designers weren't actually utilizing the computers as much in even the early 90s. But times changed, and now it's made all of these things obsolete that we used to do regularly in graphic design. And then in the 90s, there was this huge rebellion against the rigid Swiss style, and finding the computer actually made things more rugged, like Ed Fella and David Carson. So we're going to start out talking about a designer that sort of, she's been around a long time. Her name's April Greiman, and she studied at the Basel School of Design in Switzerland in the early 1970s, and she was a student of very influential designers, Armin Hoffman, Wolfgang Weingart, and she was greatly influenced by the Swiss design movement, the international style. And her embracing of newer technology, though, enabled her to move beyond that style and become much more contemporary. She rejected the belief among many contemporary designers at that time that computers and digitization would compromise the international style. And she instead sort of exploited pixelization and other digitization errors, because designers really didn't want to use the computer because they felt like it sort of degraded the work a little bit. It wasn't, the quality wasn't as high. And I remember this discussion in photography. For a long time, people didn't want to use digital cameras because they felt digital cameras weren't as good as film. So it's an interesting thing when major changes occur. There's a lot of resistance, a lot of pull until people fully embrace it usually. What's kind of interesting about her work, and I'll show it when I get to it, but she kind of embraces digitization, and she always has this little part, sometimes it's a little part of her work, sometimes it's a significant part of her work that has this pixelization in it. And it's sort of a homage to her belief that this pixelization should be celebrated and should not be considered an error. And In 1984, she lobbied successfully to change the department name of Cal Arts to visual communications instead of graphic design, because she felt that graphic design was really too limiting for future designers. So she has kind of a multidisciplinary approach, and it really extends into her current practice. She really creates a sense of depth by combining graphic elements with photography. And you can see that in a lot of her work. She combines graphics, photography. She has those little areas of pixelization, and she's really innovative with her approach to type layout. This is an installation that she had in a museum. This is an ad she did for UCLA Extension. And that's just a great example of her style and her embracing of the pixelization instead of considering it sort of less than or an error. So another designer I want to look at, because he's pretty important to modern contemporary design style, and his name is David Carson. And David Carson was recognized for breaking many of the rules in design. He kind of took design to a whole new level with his experimentation. And he had a famous quote that I think you've heard, and we had it in our essay earlier in the semester, but his quote was, "Don't mistake legibility for communication." And, you know, his history is kind of interesting too, because he started out as a high school teacher. And I think he studied, I can't remember. It was something in the liberal arts, like I want to say English or philosophy. And so he was a high school teacher, and he received a flyer for a graphic design program in Tucson, and he decided to just kind of check it out. And he took the program, and he became really interested in graphic design. And he decided that's what he wanted to do. And so he started working as a graphic designer. And one thing that's pretty important about him is he almost immediately embraced all of the newer digital tools, software including Quark Express, PageMaker, Photoshop. And this really enabled him to jump miles ahead of people who had been working in the industry for many, many years very quickly. And also, he has this sort of insane, intuitive style that I don't think is very common. I think it's his style, and his kind of innate way of approaching design is just in him. I think it's something that you don't learn. It's kind of like those fine artists that really blow your mind with their beautiful sculptures or their interesting paintings. It's something that can be refined, but it also is sort of, there's just something about him that a deep creativity that's part of his persona. And so he was able to do this even though he didn't have any formal design or art training besides a few workshops that he had taken. He really started to, experiment with all of the new digital methods that were available. And whereas in Swiss design, typography, there was a sense of visual hierarchy, and it was very important for type to be legible. Carson sort of felt like you should read the message and then interpret it. The designer is really an interpreter, and they're supposed to express themselves through their design work, which is in complete opposite of Joseph Mueller-Brockmann's philosophy, where Joseph Mueller-Brockmann felt that the designer was a problem solver, and that the client gave the problem and the designer gave the solution, and the designer should keep their own thoughts, opinions, and ideas out of the work. David Carson rejected that idea and felt like it should be about who you are as a person. You should put that into your process, which was really different. And he got a job at a magazine. I think his first magazine that he worked for was called Beach Culture, and Transworld Skateboarding, and then a surfing magazine called Beach Culture. I should probably mention too that David Carson was a really amazing surfer, and that he was at one time rated like up in the top 10 surfers in the world with his abilities. So you'll see sometimes in his work a lot of beautiful beach imagery or ocean imagery, or surfing imagery, and that I think ties into who he is as a person as well. But this technique, this layering technique, was really innovative, and this is sort of this Pepsi ad happened a lot later in his career. He wasn't working with big clients early on. He was working for these skateboarding, surfing magazines as an art director. And what happened was when he got a job with, I'm going to pull down a little bit back up here, sorry, to Raygun. I think I have an image of Raygun. It's maybe farther down my slides. Well, I'll show it when I get there. But he got a job for this magazine called Raygun, which was really an inspiring magazine for young designers because of all the innovative things that David Carson was doing with layout. This might be from Raygun. And so he started to get noticed in the design world. And big designers of the time, like Neville Brody, who was a really major design force in the industry at that time, started to notice David Carson and actually started to replicate him in their style. And so this was huge, and it got him sort of an international recognition. He also made some people really angry because he did things like, in one famous ad, he took this journalist's writing and he converted it to dingbat, and he placed it in the magazine spread as dingbat font, which no one could read. And that really made kind of that journalism industry angry. But his opinion was that the article wasn't very good and it didn't really say anything, and he wanted to express that. And so that was one thing that he did. So he's very interesting. And there's a TED Talk I want you to watch this week as well, that where he kind of talks about his process, and you can kind of engage with the type of person he was. But so he started to work later for bigger companies like Coca-Cola, although I feel his earlier style is much more interesting than these sort of later ads where it's almost like he does sort of become a little bit formulaic in his approach. But Emigre magazine, which was a very influential magazine at the time, was a digital type foundry in Berkeley. And it really was this magazine that happened or coincided with the birth of the Macintosh computer. And this particular magazine created some of the very first digital layouts. And so it, over time, received numerous innovation awards. And the Museum of Modern Art has a complete set of the magazines. And so if you can Google Emigre and look at some of the designs, they're really interesting and pretty compelling. Raygun, which was the magazine that David Carson became the art director for, was an American alternative rock and roll magazine. And it was published in 1992 in Santa Monica, California. And it was very, it had sort of a chaotic, abstract style, not always legible. Musical artists and pop culture icons were way ahead of the curve in a lot of ways in terms of design. And what happened was this little magazine that started out as a little magazine in Southern California got big people from like bands like Radiohead, Bjork, Eminem, to come and give interviews. And then they would do these articles and these spreads on these artists and bands, and it got almost immediate attention. There were 70 issues of this magazine, and it went from 1992 to 2000. And then there's other really innovative magazines like Fuse magazine. This is a couple other images of Emigre. You can see how interesting some of the layout was. This is a famous strategy by David Carson where he sort of layered type on top of type. And you see that a lot in his work. He almost uses it as a frame or as a drop shadow for larger type that he'll just sort of place on top. So the last artist I want to talk about is Neville Brody, who was greatly inspired by David Carson and incorporated a lot of Carson's techniques into his own work. Neville Brody was born in Southgate, London. He had a lot of training as an artist and a designer. He spent 3 years studying at London College of Printing, and he was very influenced by pop art and the design movement Dada. And in 1977, punk rock was pretty huge at the time, and he was inspired by this whole punk rock scene that was occurring. And if you take a class in typography, You'll learn more about him because he really was influential in his design of new typefaces. I think he designed over 20 throughout his career. And he had big clients like Macromedia, Fireworks was a huge client, and then the other one was Nike. You can see his Bounce It ad for Nike. He worked for Coca-Cola. And he did this project it's called the Fuse Project, and it was an interactive magazine that challenged ideas about typography. And the other thing that makes him significant and sort of ties him to David Carson and April Greiman is that he fully embraced technology, and he was an avid user of the computer as a design tool. Here's some graphics he created for Macromedia. Another one from Fuse. And you can see this was probably directly inspired by David Carson, where he started to layer text on top of text. Legibility became less important. Beautiful, sort of striking imagery and graphical elements. The thing that kind of separates David Carson from some of the other big designers at the time is David Carson couldn't draw, so he would always use photography and type in his work. Whereas Neville Brody, on the other hand, had a formal training in art and design, so he could definitely draw, and sometimes you'll see illustrative elements combined with typography and image. And the same with April Greiman. She could draw. You can see those graphical elements mixed in with the photography and text. But if you look at David Carson's work, nothing is very significant in terms of the drawn elements. Okay, so deconstruction, it's an interesting time, and we're sort of in this post-deconstruction period in design. But take a look at David Carson and look at some imagery, Neville Brody, April Greiman. And then I know that we're going to have this essay where you're going to be comparing the work of David Carson and Joseph Mueller Brockman. So I know you know a lot about Joseph Mueller Brockman, and now you know a little bit about David Carson, and so do some more research and then start to write that essay.